The year I turned 13, my daddy, who was a pastor, rented us a little beach cottage for a week at Folly Beach, South Carolina. Now, pastors don't make a whole lot of money, so the beach cottage that daddy rented for us, it wasn't one of these big beachfront mansions that you see today. No, it was more like a tin can with screens, a pink tin can with screens. And on the outside, it wasn't much, but on the inside, it was nasty, really nasty. It was grimy and smelly, and the windows had this yellow film on them from cigarette smoke, and the whole place stunk like beer. And my poor mother spent the first 6 hours of her vacation sweeping and dusting and bleaching down every conceivable surface in that little cottage. Because back in the day, for a preacher's wife like my mother, cleanliness really was next to godliness. Now, when she got finished, she poured herself a lemonade, and she had just sat down in a lawn chair to observe the surf and feel the sun, when all of a sudden her lovely afternoon was ruined. When three bikers came screaming down the road on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, pulled into our driveway, and moved into the cottage next door. They were wearing leather, and they had tattoos. And as soon as they got there, well, they started drinking beer. And my mother rolled her eyes, and she looked at my sister and I, and she said, "You stay away from those men, girls. They are not our kind of people." How many times had I heard that before? We were loving Christian people, but there were lots of people that were just not our kind of people. Well, the next afternoon, we decided we would play outside in the surf and the sand. Now, our kind of beach cottage didn't come with beach umbrellas or lifeguards or anything like that. There was a long pier that went way out into the water on one side of our cabin, and on the other side was this sign that said, "Riptides, swim at your own risk." We didn't know what a riptide was. We were from West Virginia. So Daddy just dove into the surf and started swimming. And I was kind of wading in and out of the froth, looking for sand dollars, when all of a sudden, I saw one of those bikers. He was striding down the pier, drinking a beer. I knew he wasn't our kind of people, but he didn't have a shirt on, and his tattooed muscles were just hanging out there for all the world to see. He was tall and muscular, tan, with short, cropped black hair and the iciest blue eyes. I knew he was very worldly. He wasn't like the boys back home. And I found him utterly scintillating. And I was newly 13, coming into my womanhood, wearing my brand new two-piece blue and white swimsuit that only a nun would call a bikini. And I was drawn to him like a moth to a flame. And I began wading further out into the surf so I could get closer to him. And I really hadn't noticed how far away from the shore I'd gone, and until suddenly the water was much deeper than I remembered it being, and the sand felt like it was sucking at my toes. And I struggled to get free, and then suddenly the sand just disappeared. I was sucked up under the water. I started screaming, and Daddy heard me, and he began swimming to me. He grabbed me, and he pulled me to himself, and he began swimming back to the shore. And then suddenly Daddy was pulled back under the water too. And I screamed and clawed his back as the salt water filled our lungs. We weren't flailing. We were drowning. We were caught in a riptide. And that's when the biker saw what was happening. And he dove into the water after us. He swam to us and pulled me away from my dad, pinned my arms to his side, and began swimming parallel to the shore. He swam all the way to that pier, and he pushed me up onto a piling, and then he spun around and headed back out for my dad. I pulled myself up that pier, and the barnacles on it cut my bare belly like knives. I was gasping. Oh, it was Daddy. Daddy was drowning. The tide had pulled him so far away from the shore, I could barely see his head bobbing up and down in the surf. But somehow the biker got to him. And again, he began swimming parallel to the shore. I raced down the pier as he pulled my daddy's limp body from the surf and rolled him over and began performing CPR. That tattooed biker, he was a U.S. Marine. It said so right on his tattoo. When Daddy finally came to, we tried to thank him for saving our lives, but he just turned and walked away. I guess maybe we weren't his kind of people. But I learned something that day. I learned that when somebody saves your life when you're dying, they are your kind of people. Some 40 years later, I found myself following a gurney down a long hallway deep into the bowels of a hospital. Deep down into one of those places where only the next of kin is allowed to be. And I was deposited into a tiny interventional radiology waiting room about the size of a supply closet. And I remember it had a ghoulish green cast that I hoped came from institutional paint and not radiation. I was a mess. But I was not alone. No, seated across from me, reading a year-old wrinkled People magazine, was a tattooed biker in a leather jacket with an orange and black Harley Davidson bandana wrapped around his head. And he leaned over and he slid his hand onto my knee and he said, "What's your story, sis?" Now, My husband was having a massive stroke. A 5.5-inch clot had flown from his left carotid artery into his brain. And I was not in the mood to chat with a middle-aged tattooed biker, especially when I saw the thin gray braid of hair that came out from under his bandana. I was having trouble finding words that night. Hearing that your husband might die before dawn does that to you. So I just pushed his hand off my knee and hoped he got the message. Which he didn't. But he didn't take it personally. He just leaned back in his chair and he said, "Well, I'll tell you why I'm here. My buddy got throwed off his hog on the parkway tonight. He's in there. They're trying to put his eye back in, stop the bleeding in his head. And I'm only here because he ain't got no one else. Didn't seem right to just leave him." And then he looked down at his worn leather boots and he pulled up his right pant leg to reveal a shaft of steel where his leg should have been. And he said, "Oh yeah, sis, I know what it's like. I got throwed off my hog 6 years or so back. Red BMW clipped me, never even slowed down. My buddies just kept on riding. I went over the rails, my hog fell on top of me, blew up, burst into flames, caught me on fire. When they brought me in here, I was a mess. I was a bloody mess. And I was all alone. A hospital ain't nowhere to be alone, sis. It ain't nowhere to be alone." I was all alone until the chaplain come in. He talked with me, and when they told me they was going to have to take my leg, well, he prayed with me. And I've been praying ever since. And I'm going to tell you what, sis, God's for real. He's for real. And I don't know what your story is, but I'm going to pray with you right now. And one way or the other, honey, no matter what happens tonight, it's going to be all right. And then he took my hand and he prayed with me. You know, it turns out that when somebody prays with you, when your husband's dying, they are your kind of people. On the darkest, scariest night of my life, God didn't send the angel Gabriel with his big white fluffy wings. He sent a tattooed Harley Davidson biker with JESUS tattooed on his knuckles. Because sometimes, apparently, the angels ride Harleys.